It came to my attention that while I was editing this video that for most of it I looked dead inside, and if you're wondering why that is, it's because that episode did leave me dead inside. So yes, enjoy a dead inside critique of the Six Thatchers. Hey friends! Okay, so it's finally here, my review of the Six Thatchers. I would like to say that I deliberately waited this long because I wanted to make sure that everyone had seen it, but the truth was I shaved my head, my cat's been sick, and I've been tired, and today's the first day that I have actually felt I have enough energy to do this. So let's go. My review of the Six Thatchers, I'm going to split it up into 6 parts. Before I start, if you haven't seen the Six Thatchers, you better get in there quick because you've only got 2 days till The Lying Detective. If you haven't seen the Six Thatchers, look away now. But the number one thing I want to talk about that was wrong with that episode was John Watson. John Watson's function as a character was essentially to be our eyes and ears in the story. He plays the same kind of role as the companion does in Doctor Who. His job is to ask the questions that we can't ask. So we need someone within the story who can ask those questions and can move the narrative forward in that regard. And that's John's main function in the narrative. It's not even necessarily to be Sherlock's best friend. That's kind of just how it patterns out, because you need someone who's close to Holmes to be able to give us as readers insight into what he's thinking and doing, even when he's not explaining. He did not do this in this episode. In fact, he was barely present in this episode. If I counted up the minutes of his screen time, it would probably end up at around 10 minutes. Maybe, probably less. And even when the times he was on screen, he was not really contributing to the plot. I asked myself the question, if I took John out of this episode, would anything be different? Actually, no. The other thing that was wrong with John's character in this is that he was very out of character. There was no grounds in the narrative for him to be feeling distant from Mary and feeling distant from Sherlock. It really didn't sit well with me. Also, it was a bit of art imitating life, with Martin and Amanda actually breaking up. You really got the feel that they weren't invested as actors nor as characters in this relationship anymore, but there was no real reason given for that. The only reason that I could sort of divine from what we were given is that, you know, John did the classic midlife crisis thing of, oh shit, I've got a wife who loves me and a baby, and that's not enough, so I'm just gonna text random bus lady. This was really like a problem with the whole narrative. They spent a lot of last season sort of implying that Mary was this great assassin, and now she had faked her death, and that the only person who knew her secret was Magnuson, and that was the whole point of Sherlock's killing him in cold blood to save Mary. And then this idea that we have waited 4 years on that cliffhanger of Sherlock murdering a man and him being punished, for that to completely be negated by a plotline of Agra, which was not at all implied in the previous episodes, really didn't match up with what we'd already been told about Agra, what we'd already been told about Mary. And Mycroft, he said, oh yeah, Agra, I know what they are. If he knew who Agra was, and if he knew what their function was, when Mary came into the picture, wouldn't he have told Sherlock initially who she was? It kind of changes the whole thing and doesn't make a lot of sense. It was kind of like Mark Addis and Stephen Moffat went, oh well, we want this to happen, so we'll just make it happen, and people won't ask why. But this does bring me to my second point, which is cliffhangers. Last year I went to a meet and greet with Mark and Stephen, and there was a Q&A, and someone asked them, do they think of the conclusions to the cliffhangers like when they think of the cliffhangers themselves? And their answer was no, that they don't. And most of the time they've been able to get away with it. In this case, I don't think they did. I watched the scandal in Belgravia because it was such a massive cliffhanger, whether or not John and Sherlock were going to get blown up at that pool, and the phone call from Irene Adler saved them, but it also meant that that was their focus for the rest of the episode. Same with the empty hearse, it sort of focused on Sherlock being reunited with everyone and settling back into London. Like, the cliffhanger of him being dead and coming back to life was the major theme for the whole episode, where every scene was relevant, every scene was necessary to understand the case. We sort of have the Six Thatchers, which, you know, we didn't just have one cliffhanger we had two cliffhangers that were coming off this episode. We had the initial one in His Last Vow, and then we also had the Christmas special, The Abominable Bride, Sherlock getting off the plane. So you made me wait 3 years for Sherlock to eat some ginger nuts and say that everything was okay. Why did we need the cliffhanger in the first place? Why did we need the Abominable Bride? And as someone who wants to be a writer, I feel like I would never do that personally, because I worked hard to build up this cliffhanger, and then to make everything that, not only the cliffhanger itself but also the whole build up, to make it all irrelevant, would feel like I am crapping all over my own writing, which is essentially what Mark and Stephen did in this episode. Number 3, messy humour. It had a lot of sort of really tokenistic dead end scenes that really didn't have anything to do with the main plot, to the point where you weren't sure what the main plot was meant to be. The baby and the christening and the whole, you know, throw the rattle at Sherlock's face and all these things, and also the dog that just seemed to be there because it would create a cute moment with Sherlock, because he's always been portrayed as this very emotionally bottled character, and for him to suddenly be like, yeah, your dog. And they felt like these tokenistic scenes that really were there to sort of fill out the episode, and also sort of go, oh well, we're gonna kill Mary, so we may as well give her some like nice moments. Number 4, disconnected relationships. Basically, I've had a theory for a lot of years that Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat don't want Sherlock's relationships to all exist at once. The best example I can give of it is in A Scandal in Belgravia, when Irene and Sherlock are alone in Baker Street, and even though I love that scene, every time I watch that scene I'm baffled by where John is. Irene sort of starts the scene by saying, you know, John went out a couple of hours ago, so like where did he go to, and where did he go to for a couple of hours in the middle of the night? Like, and Sherlock sort of goes, oh well, yeah, I was talking to him, and then kind of forgets that John has mysteriously left their apartment, and in that moment John doesn't matter to him because Irene's in the room. And this is seen like throughout the show on a lot of different occasions. You'll see Sherlock interact with people that will never interact with each other. Janine is supposedly one of Mary's best friends, and yet we only ever see her interact with Sherlock. The interesting thing about that episode is it is John and Mary's wedding, and you hardly ever see interactions between John and Mary about their wedding. They're always sort of mediated by Sherlock, and I guess you could sort of justify that by saying this show is from Sherlock's perspective. It's very strange to have a wedding episode where you don't show interactions between the bride and groom on their own. This happened again in the Six Thatchers, like Sherlock going to Mary on his own, and there wasn't really a reason to exclude John at this point. Like, he knows about Mary's past, he knows that Sherlock and Mary do obviously talk to each other, like they're obviously good friends, and yet Sherlock still invites her on her own. After the fact, after this has happened, after she's run away, Sherlock runs to John. It's not how real life works. Like, it's not accurate that all these people know each other and yet never seem to really interact with each other. John really only interacts with Mary in this episode, like through Sherlock, and they both place him above their actual relationship to the point where they forget that they've got a child. And also the fact that Sherlock texted them both separately. Mark and Stephen want to portray Sherlock's relationships as all of them sort of separate from each other in their own little lanes, and nothing more than ever confirmed that theory than this episode. Number 5, Mary dying. For all the other deaths in the show that have been fake, we haven't witnessed funerals. We saw Mary's cremation, we saw her grave, watched her physically die, and that's 3 things that have not happened in all the other sort of fake deaths. And also it's been confirmed by Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat. And this is where I run into trouble, because they say that they killed her because of the fact that she's dead in the stories. They're sort of using the canon to justify it, which really doesn't make sense because this is a modern interpretation of Sherlock Holmes. In the stories, Mary didn't have a child with John. You don't even meet her in the original stories, really. Ellie Donovan isn't a character, Molly Hooper isn't a character, Irene Adler is dead. Like, there are so many things that they have already changed about the canon. Just the setting is different. Like, we're in butt-ass Victorian London in the stories, and now we're in modern London. So the idea that the canon was the reason that they killed her just doesn't make sense. The woman who was going to kill Sherlock didn't really have motivation to, other than the fact that he was going to arrest her, but really that didn't even matter. There were police all around, like a room full of police officers and SWAT teams. Like, no one knows what to do when this woman shoots Sherlock. No one tries to push him out of the way. And then John turns up like 10 minutes late with Starbucks, like, what did I miss, guys? And then, you know, his wife is dead on the floor. And then he blames Sherlock for her death, which just like made me uncomfortable, because it meant in that moment that Mary sort of put Sherlock again above herself, and not only herself but her child. She was like ready to kill Sherlock to keep John safe. To go from that to willingly sacrificing herself and leaving her baby motherless really is not an accurate thing that she would do. Mark and Stephen wanted to kill Mary so that just Sherlock and John could be Sherlock and John could just be the boys again. And finally, number 6, misogyny. And that's really what all of this boils down to, that all men are misogynists because they are raised in a patriarchal society where they are taught from birth that they have value over females. And even if they're not explicitly taught this, they are subconsciously taught this in stories, in music, in pretty much any piece of media that's been created. All men are misogynists, and unless they make a conservative effort to unlearn those patriarchal values that have been sort of instilled in them. I don't like it when white men go and write female characters, and I know Mark is gay, but that still doesn't give him credentials to write female characters. If he's still a privileged white male, Moffat and Gaddis create these very strong, very intelligent, very complex women, and then they cook up a scenario that is pretty much unfounded, where they fall victim to the intelligence of men. Even Molly's character development is always hindered by the fact that she has this unrequited love for Sherlock. The fact that she couldn't really stand up to John and say, well, actually no, like, Sherlock is my fellow godparent of this child, so actually he needs to be here, he's your best friend. She's treated like a puppet, she just delivers John's message. Mrs. Hudson, you know, she's implied to have this, you know, great backstory of like being a stripper and running a drug cartel, and yet she's always like horrified and ooh by crime, you know, which really doesn't make sense given her background. Then we have Irene Adler, who is this wonderfully intelligent, you know, badass sort of dominatrix. Her attraction is mostly to women. I won't say that I know she says she's a lesbian, but throughout the episode she makes references to being in a relationship with men, so I really don't want to sort of erase that bisexualness there, but she admits to being mostly attracted to women, and yet, you know, the reason she fails is because she develops feelings for Sherlock. And Sally Donovan, also a woman of colour, she is basically painted as a horrible person right from the get-go when we meet her, despite the fact that she's a sergeant, which is a very high-ranking police officer. She is often painted as an idiot. Even her good ideas are often shot down by male characters. So Greg, she seems to be the only female officer in the force that has a name. And now we've got Mary, who is this really developed character, more developed than any of the others really, and she has fallen victim not only to just men, just this idea that she values her friendship with Sherlock over her own life and the life of her child, but also, like, you know, the guy who tried to kill her was a man of colour, and that's just sort of plain Brexit racism there. I can't even begin to describe how mad I was at that as a Middle Eastern person of colour, that they just sort of used the Middle East as a backdrop to like imply threat, and you know, then they had this sort of AJ, this sort of nameless Middle Eastern assassin guy who just wanted to kill Mary. The only person of colour in that episode was literally a terrorist. Basically, the best way I can describe this episode is that I will never watch it again. Ever. I'm gonna link this really good article that was a review of the Six Thatchers about the women of Sherlock. Anyway, I'll see you all for the Lying Detective and pray that something decent happens. Maybe we'll see Moriarty, because that would actually be relevant to what's happening. Bye guys, hope the week is treating you well, and weird thing to ask, but pray for my cat because she's really sick and I don't want to lose her. From your girl who's bald. Love, Mary. Bye.